The green truck and the Land Rover raced through the quiet countryside roads, heading toward Leatherslade Farm, the secret hideout the gang had chosen long before the robbery. Dawn was still an hour away, but the sky was slowly turning from pitch black to a pale gray. The robbers knew they had very little time before police checkpoints started appearing on the roads. Inside the truck, the men sat among the piles of mailbags stuffed with cash. The air smelled of old paper and diesel. Despite the adrenaline, the exhaustion started catching up. One of the robbers leaned back and whispered, "Feels like a dream, doesn't it?" Another replied, "If this is a dream, I don't want to wake up." But Bruce Reynolds, riding ahead in the Land Rover, stayed focused. He knew that success didn't depend on getting the money. It depended on disappearing afterward without leaving a trace. Around 4:45 a.m., the vehicles finally reached Leatherslade Farm. The location was perfect, isolated, hidden behind trees with no neighboring houses for miles. The farm looked like any other countryside property, with a small stable, a barn, and a creaky farmhouse. But for the gang, it was now the most important place in Britain. The truck backed up to the barn door, and the men began unloading the heavy sacks. The sound of the bags hitting the wooden floor echoed in the silent barn. Soon, a mountain of green mailbags grew in the center. Each bag was filled with money, banknotes bundled tightly with paper bands, some so old they were almost falling apart. The gang had just stolen more than $2.6 million, equivalent to over $50 million today. Inside the farmhouse, the men were tired but ecstatic. Someone opened a bottle of beer, but Bruce immediately stopped him. "No celebrating yet," he said. "We're not safe, not even close." He was right. Police would soon discover the empty train, the missing coach, and the fake signal. And once they realized the scale of the theft, they would mobilize the largest manhunt in British history. As the sun began to rise, the gang gathered around the long wooden table inside the farmhouse. The room was filled with cash bags. Before them was the most time-consuming part of the plan, sorting and counting the money. They needed to divide the notes, remove marked bills, and organize the final shares. They had brought along a retired army officer, known as the Ulsterman, to help manage the counting operation. For the next several hours, the farmhouse buzzed with activity. Cash was emptied onto the table in huge piles. Bundles were sorted by value, $1 notes, 5 notes, and 10 notes. Men sat in chairs, counting stacks by hand, forming neat piles and writing totals on notepads. It was slow, repetitive, and exhausting, but the excitement made it feel unreal. In the middle of counting, one of the younger gang members laughed and said, "I've never held this much money in all my life." Another answered, "You're holding more than the Bank of England right now." Meanwhile, miles away near Briddigo Bridge, police officers were swarming the scene. They inspected the tracks, the signals, and the empty mail coach. The moment the investigators saw the fake glove-covered glove on the signal, they realized they were dealing with professionals. More units arrived. Dogs were brought in. Helicopters were prepared. Scotland Yard was notified. By late morning, the robbery was headline news across the country. Detectives began piecing together the sequence of events. They knew the robbers had to dump the bags somewhere. They also suspected the group had used a nearby hideout. They spread out, scanning farms, barns, and empty buildings within a large radius. The net was slowly tightening. Back at Leatherslade Farm, the gang continued counting, unaware that their biggest mistake had already been made, staying at the hideout far longer than planned. The original idea was simple: count the money quickly, leave by sunrise, and wipe the farm clean of fingerprints. But the enormous amount of cash slowed them down. Instead of a few hours, they needed days. By noon, they finally finished counting. The total was staggering: over $2.6 million stolen in less than 30 minutes. Spirits were high, and someone joked about retiring on a beach. But Bruce called everyone together. "Listen," he said firmly, "this is the most dangerous moment. We have the money, but if they catch us now, it means nothing. We must leave and destroy every trace that leads back here." The plan was to burn the farmhouse, wipe the fingerprints, and vanish separately. But before they could act, the gang debated. Some argued to rest a few hours. Others pushed for leaving immediately. The disagreement created delays that would cost them dearly. As they prepared to leave, one of the men suggested calling a trusted associate to help clean the farmhouse later. It seemed like a small idea, but it was a fatal mistake. This associate would soon panic, leave evidence behind, and lead the police straight to Leatherslade Farm. By the evening of August 8th, the robbers were convinced they had pulled off the perfect crime. They left the farmhouse, leaving behind the empty mailbags, bedding, food wrappers, and newspapers, everyday items that seemed harmless. But to the police, they would become clues that would slowly unravel everything. As the sun set on August 8th, the gang members quietly slipped away from Leatherslade Farm, each heading in different directions. They believed they had outsmarted the entire country. The robbery had gone flawlessly, the money was safely divided, and the farmhouse was supposed to be cleaned of every trace of their presence. But what they didn't realize was that the smallest mistakes, and unnoticed by them in the moment, were already waiting like traps. The police investigation had now become the most urgent case in the United Kingdom. Scotland Yard assigned dozens of detectives, including their top men. Newspapers were calling it the crime of the century, and every citizen in Britain was talking about the men behind the daring heist. Pressure built quickly. Politicians demanded answers. Officers worked around the clock, determined to find any clue. At Bridego Bridge, detectives discovered the mailbags, scattered footprints, and the damaged signal equipment. The fake glove left on the signal switch confirmed one thing. The robbers were skilled, organized, and confident. But the biggest breakthrough came later that evening when a local farm worker reported something strange. An abandoned truck, hidden deep in the woods several miles away. Police rushed to the location. Inside the truck, they found torn mailbags and traces of mud that matched the soil near the railway line. Detectives stared at each other. This was it, the first real lead. They formed a search grid, scanning every nearby property. Helicopters circled overhead. Officers knocked on doors, questioned farmers, and inspected barns. It didn't take long before they reached Leatherslade Farm. From the outside, the farmhouse looked peaceful and ordinary. The front door was closed, the windows were dark, and the yard seemed untouched. But when detectives entered the barn, they immediately sensed something unusual. The air smelled like wool, paper, and diesel, the same scent found in the abandoned truck. The officers searched every corner. Then, inside the farmhouse, they found what the gang had failed to remove. Empty food cans, bed sheets, newspapers, cigarette butts, playing cards, and personal items that should have been burned. The robbers had planned to clean the place thoroughly, but disagreements and fatigue caused them to rush their escape. A detective picked up a newspaper scattered on the table. It was dated the day before the robbery. Some pages had fingerprints on them. Another detective found a Monopoly board on the floor. But it wasn't just a game. The money on the table wasn't Monopoly money at all. The gang had used real stolen banknotes to replace the fake ones as they played. It was a gold mine of evidence. Soon, forensic experts arrived. They dusted every surface. They found fingerprints on cups, bottles, chairs, and even the farmhouse staircase. They lifted boot prints from the floor. They discovered the gang's numbers scribbled in a notebook. Every tiny mistake the robbers made now turned into a weapon for the police. Meanwhile, miles away, the gang members celebrated quietly in their safe houses and hotel rooms. They felt invisible. Some planned to leave the country. Others talked about investing their money. But Bruce Reynolds sensed danger. He read the news, saw the urgency in the police response, and knew they had underestimated the detectives. He warned the others to stay hidden, to avoid showing any signs of sudden wealth. But not everyone listened. One of the robbers bought a new car. Another moved into a better flat. Someone began spending more money than usual at pubs. The police received anonymous tips from neighbors noticing suspicious changes in behavior. Back at Scotland Yard, detectives began assembling a list of known criminals with the skills to pull off such a robbery. Expert drivers, safecrackers, ex-military planners, signal technicians. As they cross-referenced fingerprints from the farmhouse with their criminal database, several matches appeared. The first breakthrough name, Ronnie Biggs. Then came others, Bruce Reynolds, Buster Edwards, Tommy Wisby, Jimmy White, and more. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. Police teams quickly formed arrest squads. They spread across London, Surrey, and other locations. They moved quietly at night, kicking down doors in coordinated operations. One by one, the robbers were caught. Some surrendered peacefully, shocked that the police had traced them so quickly. Others tried to run, but the officers were prepared. The news exploded across the country. Headlines declared, "Train robbers captured." Crowds gathered outside police stations, hoping to catch a glimpse of the men behind the legendary crime. The public was fascinated, almost impressed by how boldly the gang had executed the heist. But not everyone was caught. Bruce Reynolds, the mastermind, went into deep hiding. He changed locations constantly, stayed off the grid, and avoided old contacts. For him, the real challenge was just beginning, staying free for as long as possible. Back at Leatherslade Farm, detectives continued collecting evidence long after the arrests began. The farmhouse, once a temporary home for the gang, had become a museum of clues. Every cigarette, every fingerprint, every newspaper page helped build the case. By the end of the week, police had connected nearly all the major suspects. The gang's perfect robbery was beginning to crack, apart not because of lack of planning during the heist, but because of small human mistakes afterward. The robbers had escaped with millions of pounds. But the question still remained. Could they escape justice? The answer was coming next. The arrests were happening fast, but the story was far from over. As some members of the gang sat in custody, others were still on the run, hiding in safe houses, sleeping in barns, or using fake names in cheap hotels across the country. Every man knew the police were closing in. Every knock on the door made their hearts jump. And every newspaper headline reminded them the net was tightening. One of the most hunted men was Bruce Reynolds, the mastermind. Bruce wasn't just a criminal. He was a strategist. He could see patterns that others missed. And he understood one thing better than anyone. Getting arrested now meant losing everything. So he vanished into the shadows. He avoided familiar faces, moved constantly, and didn't take unnecessary risks. For months, Bruce managed to stay one step ahead of Scotland Yard. But the police were determined. Detectives worked long nights analyzing maps, tracking relatives and listening to whispers from informants. The pressure from the government was enormous. They had to prove Britain's justice system could catch the men who embarrassed the entire nation. Meanwhile, the arrested gang members were transferred to secure facilities for questioning. In the cold interview rooms, detectives placed the evidence on the tables: fingerprints from the farmhouse, boot impressions, notebooks, newspapers, and even the board from the Monopoly game they played with real money. Some of the men stayed silent, refusing to admit anything. Others made mistakes, small slips that detectives used to corner them. As the trial date approached, the British press treated the case like a national event. Reporters stood outside the courthouse every day. Crowds gathered to watch the robbers arrive in police vans. Some people saw them as criminals, but others admired the daring of the heist. One reporter wrote, "They stole millions without firing a bullet." The country is strangely fascinated. Inside the courtroom, tension filled the air. The prosecution worked relentlessly, presenting photos from the farmhouse, fingerprints matched to the suspects, and testimonies from officers who raided the scene. They described the precision of the robbery, the planning, and the escape. And then they highlighted the mistakes that led to the capture. The jury listened closely. The defense tried to argue that the evidence was circumstantial. They suggested the farmhouse could have been used by someone else. But the fingerprints told a different story. Each match was another nail in the coffin. During breaks, the robbers whispered to each other. Some tried to stay confident. Others looked shaken. The realization was slowly sinking in. The perfect crime was beginning to crumble. Back outside the courtroom, the media continued to fan the flames. Headlines read, "Millions stolen, justice closing in." Television reporters spoke of the case daily. The trial became one of the most talked about events in British legal history. Behind the scenes, police were still hunting the last remaining robbers. One by one, more men were found. Some were hiding with relatives, some in rented flats, others in small towns where they hoped to blend in. But the officers were patient. They watched bank accounts, monitored contacts, and traced movements. Slowly, the remaining pieces of the puzzle came together. As the trial neared its end, the judge prepared to announce the verdict. A heavy silence filled the courtroom. The robbers looked straight ahead, knowing their fate was moments away. The judge spoke about the scale of the crime, the planning, and the damage done to British trust in the railway mail system. Then he delivered the sentences. Long, harsh, and shocking to the public. Some gang members received 25 to 30 years in prison, some of the longest sentences ever given for a robbery in British history. Gasps echoed in the courtroom. One man shook his head in disbelief. Another stared at the floor, expressionless. They had expected punishment, but not this. But even with the verdict delivered and most of the gang behind bars, the story wasn't finished. The most elusive man of all, Bruce Reynolds, had still not been caught. He remained a ghost, moving through Europe, staying in cheap apartments, using fake passports, relying on old criminal contacts. For months, Bruce lived like this, constantly alert, constantly moving, never trusting anyone completely. But the money was running low, and the pressure was rising. Every border crossing was a risk. Every unfamiliar face in a cafe made him suspicious. Back in Britain, detectives never stopped hunting him. They knew Bruce was the key to the entire robbery, and they were determined that the mastermind would not escape justice forever. As winter approached, a rumor surfaced, a whisper, a hint that Bruce Reynolds had been spotted abroad, living quietly under a new identity. The officers didn't know it yet, but the final chapter of the greatest manhunt in British history was about to begin. The chase for the mastermind was reaching its final stage, and the world was about to witness one of the most dramatic captures of the entire case.